Good evening and welcome to the Open Classroom, which is a part of Northeastern University's outreach to our broader communities. Tonight, we have the great privilege of hearing from four guest speakers who have been dealing with the very troublesome issue of climate justice as it relates to our cities and as it relates to racial justice and to resilience within our cities. I remind everyone that this program is being live streamed. It will be archived and therefore available for future viewing. Your comments therefore will go out to the world. And we ask that if you have questions or comments, you post them in our question and answer box. And you can also keep up with us through the chat. Next week, we will be dealing with some pre-election matters, particularly as they relate to the United States Supreme Court and activities that have gone on there over the past few years. And the week after that, which is the Wednesday night after the election, we're going to have a more free-form, almost teach-in-like activity that will bring together a number of people to process whatever we know about the election at that point. I can tell you at this moment that Governor Michael Dukakis, who ran for president, will be one of our guests that evening, but we're going to have a number of guests from the university and outside the university on that evening after the election. Our guests tonight are four individuals who have been deeply involved in assessing the intersections between climate and race and resilience and urban planning. I'm going to let each of them speak about their own backgrounds and their research in their commentary. And we welcome any comments or questions that you may have, which you can begin to post in the Q&A box starting now. Our first speaker is Francis Roberts-Gregory, who joins us from, I believe, the West Coast, actually. And we'll open with her, and then each of the speakers will introduce themselves. Francis, you're on.
All right. Good evening, everyone. So excited to be a part of this amazing and very timely panel. So I would first like to start off with a land acknowledgement. So as a postdoctoral researcher at Northeastern, I have to acknowledge that the territory on which Northeastern stands is the land of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. Also, I am associated with UC Berkeley on the West Coast, but I'm currently in New Orleans, which is also known as Bobancha, which is a Choctaw word. And this region is home to many indigenous peoples, including the Homa, Choctaw, Chitimacha, Tunica, Biloxi, and many others. And so tonight we're going to talk about the intersections of energy, environmental, and climate justice. And I often like to think of these terms as a trifecta. And it's important to understand that they all fall under this larger umbrella that's really trying to address environmental racism and also different types of environmental violence. And so when we talk about energy justice, as many of you may or may not know, we're really talking about who is burdened and who gets to benefit from participating in our energy systems and also devising our energy policies. And we also are discussing centering those who are historically harmed by the energy system. When we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about the disproportionate siting of hazardous waste facilities in communities of color and other frontline communities. We're also talking about the lack of representation of people of color in environmental decision making. And then finally, we're talking about the lack of enforcement of environmental laws and regulations as we see in our current political regime here in the United States. Finally, when we talk about climate justice, there's so many different definitions, but we're really referring to how those who contribute to least to rising greenhouse gas emissions bear the brunt of harm from climate disaster. And we can see that particularly here, for example, in Louisiana, we've just been hit by many storms, including Hurricane Laura. And we see how those communities are also that have been hit the most or harmed the most are located in sacrifice zones. So you may be wondering who I am and why I'm on this panel with this distinguished panel, I should say. So I am an eco-womanist ethnographer, also a feminist political ecologist and environmental educator. I actually have roots in at least 3 environmental justice communities in the United States. I experienced energy insecurity as a child, growing up with a single parent in public housing as well as homeless shelters. Also, many of my relatives on the East Coast are impacted by storms. And we can talk about rising seas and how the seas are rising, have the highest rate of sea level rise, I should say, on the Gulf Coast and the East Coast of the United States. And then also, in terms of environmental justice, I can talk about how my family in Duplin County, North Carolina, is home to industrial hog and chicken farmings. So these topics are really, I'm passionate about these topics and they're really important to me. So my research, I am interested in how Gulf Coast women of color navigate contradictory relationships with energy and petrochemical industries, also how they resist racism and imagine post-apocalyptic futures or solutions for climate justice. And this is important because oftentimes in the literature and also within our practitioner spaces, we think about women of color as victims as opposed to change agents. And my work as an intervention tries to negate this narrative and also present alternatives. So my work is also multi-scalar, it's interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary as you will, and it's autoethnographic. So I focus on my own experience as a woman of color, doing this work and also engaging with communities via community-based research. And so when we think about women of color's environmental activism, we really need to focus on everyday activism. Yes, it's very, as they say, sexy to talk about the large scale protests, folk who are engaging in the international climate negotiations. And many women of color do indeed participate in these spaces, but they also engage with energy, environmental, and climate justice in more subtle ways. For example, having conversations with loved ones who work in the oil and gas industry, engaging in mutual aid, particularly in this post-COVID context, such as creating herbal medicine, sharing plants, engaging in urban gardening. We can also talk about folk who were fighting evictions during hurricane and folks who are standing up for essential workers such as sanitation workers for better pay and personal protective equipment. There's so many examples. We can also talk about the role of environmental literacy and the importance of environmental education. Women of color often use education as a gateway to everyday activism. So for example, I've noticed that many Black and Indigenous women in Louisiana engage in curriculum development and also engage youth via long-standing, well-respected environmental justice organizations. So we can talk about the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and their Gulf Equity Water Corps project to engage Black and brown youth in Texas and Louisiana around sea level rise and catch basins and other important topics such as street flooding. And so I know there's only a limited amount of time and I want to give the other panelists an opportunity to speak, but I want to talk about the growing importance of transnational environmental activism. So women of color and organizations such as the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, and also individuals who are part of the Climate Justice Network are engaging in the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal. And this is a transnational coalition of feminist organizations that are focused on how do we elevate the voices of women and other marginalized people on the front lines, and also how do we get the larger public to understand that care work and care and jobs in the care sectors are actually green jobs. And so really understanding that we can't advance a green agenda without addressing gender inequality. So there's 10 principles for the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal. I encourage anyone to check them out if you're really interested in understanding how we can invest in the social and physical infrastructure. Finally, I think it's important to talk about how feminists of color and allies are planning for this post-election season. So, I should say feminists and women's rights activists, climate activists, and the feminist agenda for a Green New Deal are currently planning for at least 3 different election outcomes. And I think this is an activity that other everyday folk as well as policymakers can engage in. Also, thinking about critically about strategies for surviving the pandemic, climate crisis, the current political moment, and just layered, we could say, unnatural disasters. And I would say for any of you, I know there's a lot of students in the audience tonight. If you are interested in getting more involved, please check out The Count, which is a practical guide to defending the Constitution in the 2020 election. Also, think about ways to hold teach-ins, and even if you're interested to serve as a poll worker, because when we talk about the gendered impacts of voter suppression, we can talk about how voter suppression particularly targets Indigenous and Black communities, and how for a simple solution such as working as a poll worker can actually address some of those inequalities. And when we talk about individuals who are showing at the polls, oftentimes that is women of color. So I would just like to conclude and say that I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have tonight. And I'm looking forward to hearing the other suggestions from my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Frances. And let me also note that over the last couple of months since school began, Northeastern has registered over 700 students to vote, many for the first time in this upcoming election. And we're working closely with the city of Boston and have recruited and will be placing a number of students as poll workers in our Matthews arena, which will be used as a polling place for the national election. So there are a lot of ways of engaging politically, to be sure, in a nonpartisan way and in an activist way that advocates for certain key issue outcomes. Let me turn the screen over to my colleague, Joan Fitzgerald, whose research on justice and resilience has produced a new book, which I hope she will talk about. So Joan, you're on.
Okay. Okay. Here's my screen. Everyone, can you see? Okay, good. So my research for most of my career has been about urban economic development. And in 2003, I wrote a book asking, what would urban economic development look like if equity and sustainability were the key principles guiding it? And since then, my work has flipped that, asking more about and focusing more on sustainability and then specifically climate change and how we link that to economic development opportunities and creating more equitable cities. So as Ted has mentioned, my book came out this spring called Greenovation, focusing on urban leadership on climate change in North American and the European cities. So what is Greenovation? For those of you from Boston, you might have heard about Greenovate Boston. And with their permission, I stole the term and turned it into Greenovation to talk about what I think is necessary to move the climate agenda forward. I think we're not moving as quickly and aggressively as we need to, and Greenovation is about how to do that. So what is it? It's setting aggressive climate goals with a strategy and accountability for achieving them. A lot of cities are establishing very aggressive climate goals, but don't necessarily have an agenda for and a timeline for achieving them. So that's the first order of business. The second order is experimentation. So if you think about it, the very first climate action plan in the United States was Portland, Oregon in 1993. And for the rest of the cities, if they have one, started in about 2008. So this is new to urban planning, and it does require a considerable amount of trying new things. There's always a reticence in the planning profession and among elected officials, and that's largely because you don't want to have failures. And if you're experimenting, you have failures. And given our election cycles, there's often a timidity that we need to get beyond. The next part of it is being a learning organization, in that cities have to formalize a way of learning from the experimentation and what is going on. The other element is linking climate action to economic development and social equity goals, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight. But the last one that I do want to mention is this idea of catching contradictions. So what do I mean? In Greenovation, one of the cities that I look at in terms of expanding electric vehicles is London. And it's converting its buses, the whole taxi, the London taxi is converting to electric. They've got zones for electric vehicles that are going to keep expanding. So lots of really good policy on one hand. On the other hand, for many years, did nothing about Uber and the expansion of Uber. So it was a situation in which everything they were doing on expanding electric vehicles was being undone by the number of non-electric vehicles that Uber was putting into the system. And finally, London remedying that. But it's a real problem with many of our urban climate actions, is that there's contradictory things that contradict them. So in Greenovation, what I focus on, not exclusively, but mostly, are the three biggest sources of carbon emissions for cities: buildings, energy, and transportation. And then look at what are the leading strategies, the most aggressive strategies. What is it that enables some cities to really advance on those? What are those policies, and how can you get there if your city is not there? And then looking at what those economic development and equity linkages are. So let's start with buildings. For most cities, it's buildings or transportation and the energy used within them that are the biggest source of emissions. So what is a leading city in terms of buildings? I argue that a city either has to adapt passive house principles as its building energy code, or what's called zero net emissions. And the idea of passive house is that you orient buildings so that they're taking full advantage of passive solar, but also these are very highly insulated buildings, and generally use, some at the best form require no external sources of heating. For most places, it's about an 80% reduction in energy use. A lot of that is encompassed in zero net energy or emissions, but the difference is a requirement of a certain amount of energy that's not produced within the, or not from passive sources, to be from renewable energy. So if those are the standards, how is that being implemented? And what does it have to do with equity? So I'll first take you to Philadelphia, where we have this building. This is obviously a mock-up of it, Onion Flats in Philadelphia, but this is ultra low income housing. And it's the brainchild of Tim McDonald, who is an architect who was experimenting. How do you do passive house in low income housing that's affordable and works for the developer? And he built this at about 2% higher cost than a regular building would have cost. And he kind of got religion on this whole topic and looked for ways for states to incentivize it in their subsidies that go to developers for building low income housing. And this has proved to be a very effective strategy. 17 states now promote it, and he promotes it, obviously. Here's his happy hour related to this. Massachusetts is also a leader in this area. And one of the problems is not that passive house isn't doable, it's that developers and architects don't believe it's doable. And so what Massachusetts did through our Clean Energy Center was to create this design challenge as a way of bringing along the development community into realizing you can do this. So what they did was offer incentives up to $5,000 per unit for the developers to develop multifamily passive house. And so the idea is if you bring along the development community, then this can become the standard in a state. New York is also a leader on passive house development, and they're building it throughout the state. So again, even in northern climates, we can build to the passive house standard, not just for high-end single-family housing, but we can do it for multifamily housing, and we can do it for low-income housing, and developers can make a profit on that. So that is one aspect.
We seem to have a freeze, and we'll work on getting that fixed momentarily.
Okay, just tell me when I'm back.
You're back.
Okay. Yeah, I'm getting the internet is unstable. I don't know where I stopped, but we need to focus on rental housing as well. Here's an example that's part of Los Angeles's Green New Deal. Really intensive energy efficiency, and this gives you a picture of what they're doing in low-income housing. But the other aspect of this is they're doing job training in the communities where they're doing these efficiency retrofits so that it becomes a job creation facility. And for those of you who have followed the various iterations of a Green New Deal, you know that building efficiency is a top priority, and partly because it's the first order of business in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But the other aspect of it is it's also the top job creator. And taking this even a step further, another city that I follow closely is Oakland. And in West Oakland, they're not only doing, West Oakland is a city that, or is part of the city, a low-income neighborhood, housing three highways, a waste treatment facility, and a port, as well as a peaker plant that is run on jet fuel. And what the city did with a lot of aid from the state was go into this city, into this community, do very intensive energy retrofits, but also doing fuel switching and switching out fossil fuel completely out of housing. But the other aspect of this was they got rid of the peaker plant to replace it with solar powered battery system. So also increasing the resilience of this community. And again, connecting this to jobs for people in the community as part of a Green New Deal. So let's move on quickly to energy as a focus. There are two basic ways in terms of looking at low-income communities where renewable energy can dominate in a city. One is community choice aggregation. In Greenovation, I look at several cities that are doing this. The idea is the city becomes the purchaser of the electric supply, typically in order to move that supply to renewable energy. We still work with the utilities on delivering it and offering much lower rates to address the issue of energy burden in low-income communities. California is a real leader on this, and this is just a map that shows all the places in California that are creating jobs in renewable energy through community choice aggregation. Currently, about 17, maybe 18 states use community choice, allow community choice aggregation. But another one that I want to talk about very quickly here is community solar. And that is, only about 50% of households could actually put solar on their roofs, either because they can't afford it or their roofs aren't amenable to it, or because they live in multi-unit buildings. And so one solution has been to buy into a group purchasing of solar energy. And here's just a really great example of this. Austin Energy, which is a municipally owned utility, had planned on building community solar and wanted to place it in this community in Austin, an environmental justice community called La Loma. And when they did, they had no particular interest in the community itself. And this longtime community organizer, Pete Rivera, said, wait a minute, you're putting this in our community. Can't we have access to this energy as well? And negotiated a deal in which half of the energy from this community solar project is subsidized and goes to low-income residents of the neighborhood. And it was a real victory in terms of making renewable energy accessible to all people in the community. So just a real quick example in terms of transportation. One of my favorite cities in this regard is Los Angeles. And I know your first reaction might be, you've got to be kidding. Los Angeles, smog, traffic, why is it a leader in terms of equity in transportation? And Los Angeles is doing more than many other cities right now in the expansion of public transportation, but also making the transition from its entire bus fleet to electric vehicles. And what makes this an equity policy as well is that it's creating jobs. So Los Angeles is enough of a market with its bus system that it can say, okay, if we're going to purchase buses, if you want to sell us buses, you're going to produce them here. And so BYD, Build Your Dream, a Chinese company, was recruited, came there, didn't want to unionize at first, but over time, it's a long story that I won't tell now, ended up being a union shop that prioritized hiring low-income residents of Los Angeles communities. And this was brought to be by Jobs to Move America, a group that started in Los Angeles, but is now working throughout the country in making sure that transit invests.
Well, another example of unstable internet, which is an issue that many communities are dealing with at this moment.
Absolutely. Am I dead?
You're back.
Okay.
And we're just about ready for the next speaker as well.
Okay. So I will just close very quickly by saying that cities are really leading the way. Here's the Green New Deal of LA, the Green New Deal of New York, and whatever we do in our federal program on a Green New Deal, we really need to connect it to the work of cities. Thank you.
So as a reminder to all who are watching, we welcome your questions, and we ask that you post those questions in the Q&A box, and we will address and answer as many as we can get to after all of our speakers have presented. Our third speaker is Dr. Jennie Stephens, who is the director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern. She similarly has produced from her research on energy justice a new book, which hopefully she will talk about. in her remarks. And again, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A and not so much in the chat. And Jennie, you're on.
Great. Well, thank you, Ted. And I want to thank Ted for hosting us in this evening's open classroom with a focus on climate and energy justice. And it's a pleasure to share the forum with Francis, who we're welcoming to Northeastern as a postdoctoral future faculty fellow, and Joan, who's a faculty member also in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, and Shalanda, who's also in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs joint with the law school. So it's a great opportunity for us to share our intersectional work in this area of climate energy justice. So thank you for being here, and thanks for having us. As Ted mentioned, I have a new book just out last month, and Ted actually wrote the foreword for my book. And the focus is really about diversifying power, why we need anti-racist feminist leadership on climate and energy. And I propose that we all should be thinking about anti-racist feminist leadership in everything we do. Obviously, I've been working on climate and energy for most of my career, the past 20 years, and it really has not been the focus. And it's really, I think we're at a time and a moment where it's really important for us to realize and to embrace and endorse anti-racist feminist leadership. And I'll tell you a little bit in the 10 minutes I have about why, and hopefully it's an inspiring story too, because the book really showcases a lot of motivating, inspiring, innovative leaders that are doing really great work. So I want to center the climate crisis within the economic injustice that we are living with right now. If you look at the past 40 years, particularly in the United States, this is happening in other countries as well, but in the United States, it's worse. The widening income and wealth gap, we have the top 1% sharing their share of national income and share of national wealth has just been continuing to increase, whereas for everyone else, the percentage of income and wealth is decreasing. And when we look at racial economical patterns, the racial disparities are even worse, and a part of this story here too. And the reason that this is so problematic and how it's related to climate and energy justice is because of the polluter elite. So many of the top 1% are actually profiting from continuing fossil fuels and resisting the transition toward a renewable-based energy system. And they've been doing that through a misinformation campaign, denying climate science, undermining public trust in government and regulations to protect our health, and minimizing worker protections and worker rights. And so this is really a concentration in wealth and power that has been working for those in power and the top 1%, and that has infiltrated our politics and our policies so much that we have been underinvesting in so many ways in the place where we find ourselves in this very difficult time right now is a accumulation of this pattern that is persisting. So I propose the climate crisis is really a crisis in leadership. We have been, the polluter elite and others have been really trying to keep climate change as an issue that isn't something that we can prioritize. It's too far off in the distance, or it's also often talked about in the public discourse in very technocratic ways. And that really doesn't connect with what people wake up every day worrying about. And it's often, a focus on decarbonization and greenhouse gas emission reductions and goals. And when we think about it in those, and it also has an assumption that technology will fix it for us. And with that climate isolationism lens, we've been missing opportunities for improving the human condition by our response to the climate crisis. So what I propose as an alternative is this framework of energy democracy, which is about thinking about the transition away from fossil fuels to renewables as a opportunity to really redistribute power literally and figuratively, and thinking about investing in people and communities, basing our investments on social justice and human dignity, and leveraging the urgency of the climate crisis for that transformation to happen. And so when I talk about the energy democracy future, and you think about a vision of a renewable-based future, we're not just thinking about solar and wind, but also on the coastal areas could be wave and tidal energy and offshore wind, and inland could also be some micro hydro and geothermal energy, as well as solar and wind. So we're really envisioning locally appropriate mix of renewable energy. And what's amazing about that is that renewable energy is abundant, plentiful, and actually free as a resource. And so that's why it's really transformative. But that's also why the organizations and individuals who've been profiting off of the fossil fuel infrastructure are resisting that transformation. So what I really am focusing on is, when you think about leadership, we really want to be growing the squad. And many of you may be familiar with the squad in terms of the 4 congresswomen who have come on the national stage just in the past couple of years and really changed the discourse with climate energy, connecting it explicitly to jobs and housing, and also even connecting it to our criminal justice system as well. So what we need to move away from is patriarchal leadership that is intentionally excluding people, concentrating wealth and power, exacerbating inequities, and actually denying all of the systemic problems that we are facing. Not only does the patriarchal leadership deny that we have a climate crisis, they're denying even the dangers of the pandemic. They're denying that we have structural racism. They're denying that we have an economic crisis. So exclusion and denial is a very intentional strategy. So instead of that, what we all should be focusing on is anti-racist feminist leadership, which is based on collaboration, inclusivity, redistributing wealth and power, focusing on investments in communities and families and workers' rights, and thinking about reducing inequities and disparities by centering economic justice, racial justice, and social justice. And we need to leverage the transformation by linking the problems together rather than thinking of them in isolation. So the different chapters of my book kind of go through resisting the polluter elite, which is one whole section of trying to acknowledge and reveal the dangers and the influence that the fossil fuel industry has had in our university system, in our court system. And Uncook My Campus is an organization that does that. We have leaders like Maura Healey, who's a Northeastern alum, our Attorney General here in Massachusetts, who's been resisting the polluter elite by suing ExxonMobil for their consumer fraud rules. And then leaders like Jackie Patterson of the NAACP, who heads up the Environmental and Climate Justice Program, who has been instrumental in helping and revealing to a lot of Black communities how the fossil fuel industry has been intentionally manipulating and co-opting them, often even with financial incentives to support their fossil fuel infrastructure. So other leaders that are really connecting climate energy with jobs and economic justice, Varshini Prakash is one of the co-founders of the Sunrise Movement. She and others have really been very collectively and collaboratively trying to connect economic justice and economic prosperity with climate and energy, and then also in collaboration with the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements, and really working on the coalition building and connecting in preparation for a potential Green New Deal. And then there are other leaders who are really focusing on workforce development and jobs, and making sure that the job training and the jobs that are merging with the new renewable-based future are accessible and to communities who have been historically excluded. So another key way of innovative way to focus on climate energy is to elevate the health, well-being, and nutritious food connections with climate and energy, which again, with the technocratic way of thinking about climate, we often don't do this as much as we should. And they're leaders like Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice, who's among the first to do research to demonstrate the disparate health impacts of fossil fuel and other industrial toxicity exposures to Black communities. Women like Mildred McLean of Herrenby House Citizens for Environmental Justice, who's among the many who are saying we're sick and tired of being sick and tired. And many other leaders who have been connecting health with climate, and connecting with food. And I'm not going to go through all because of the time constraints here, but I will just mention Dorcetta Taylor, who is the researcher who's pointed out how the whiteness of the environmental community has limited the scope and scale of what environmentalism has been in the United States for so long, and really working on why we need to diversify the environmental movement and connecting that. I'll mention also here Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. She is among other leaders of countries who are most effective, have been most effective in managing the coronavirus. If you think about Taiwan, Denmark, Germany, and New Zealand are among the countries that have been most effective, and all countries led by women who've taken decisive, strict measures and then communicated with empathy, compassion, and trust why those measures are necessary, not just for your own health, but the health of the community and the health of the country. I also connect with transportation and getting beyond the electric vehicle technological discourse around clean energy and transportation, really with a focus on Ayanna Presley, my representative here, and for many of us. She is really focused on transit equity and transit justice in all of the transportation policy. And Michelle Wu, who's here in Boston, is a Boston City Councilor and also running for mayor. And she's proposed her version of the Green New Deal for Boston, and it includes free transportation, free public transit. So making the T and the buses and the subways free as a mechanism to support and engage in issues of the economic injustices that are so prevalent. Greta Thunberg obviously is an example of somebody else, another leader who's demonstrated kind of an innovative way to connect climate energy with transportation. When she came over to North America for the climate talks last year, she traveled by sailboat. And finally, I want to mention connect with housing and how we are in a housing crisis in this country, and Representative Ilhan Omar has been among the leaders who's really been emphasizing the huge need for public investment in public housing. And we're about to experience evictions, and we have no plan for where people are going to go. And it's a dire situation that, again, a lot of leaders are ignoring or denying that this is a real problem. So I want to wrap up here, but just mention a few other examples of Moms for Housing in Oakland and the Tiny House Warriors in Canada, Indigenous women who are protesting fossil fuel pipelines with their own strategy related to housing and home. So I'll end here with just saying there's a lot of opportunities for all of us to leverage our collective power. And when we talk about leadership, it's not just elected officials' leadership, but we all can be leaders in our own organizations, in our own families, communities, faith-based organizations. And obviously we're in a very divisive time. And I will just acknowledge, one, we need to connect across the divide. And Mary Robinson, who is a former president of Ireland and a leader in kind of climate justice internationally, she has really advocated for a very people's first approach, right? If we focus on what people need and how we can prioritize our investments in society and the way we structure society to meet what people need, we will ameliorate the climate energy crises. And I'll also honor Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to run for president in 1972. In some ways, we've come a long way since then, and in other ways, not so much. So I will end there, and I will just say that my book, all author proceeds from the book will go to NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program, and I look forward to the discussion with my colleagues, and thank you very much.
Hey, Jenny, this is Jean. Ted had to reboot, so would you introduce Shalanda for us?
Sure. So it's my privilege to hand over the Zoom box to Shalanda Baker, who is a professor of law and public policy here at Northeastern, and doing great work as well. So Shalanda, take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, Jenny, for filling in for Ted there. I don't think he actually was going to share too many words on my behalf, so I appreciate that generous introduction. I also just want to appreciate my fellow panelists and colleagues and welcome Frances to Northeastern. We are so excited about your scholarship and so excited to have you among us. You're definitely with your people here. So I also just want to acknowledge the 70 people that are participating tonight. It's dinner time, and I'm sure, like me, many of you have been on Zoom calls all day. So with a lot of gratitude, I began this talk. And so I'm going to take you on a little bit of a world tour in 12 minutes or less, starting in Mexico, which is a place that was a great teacher to me. I used to practice law, and I found myself in Mexico as I was transitioning from legal practice to academia. And one of the things I encountered when I arrived in Mexico in 2009/10 was that there were indigenous peoples fighting against wind energy development. And they were fighting against mega wind development. And for me, for lack of a better term, a light bulb went off. And in that moment, I realized that we might replicate the inequalities that are baked into our existing fossil fuel system in this climate change mitigation effort, right? In our transition away from fossil fuels. And that is, so long as we are relying on the same logics, the same personnel, and the same approaches to development. And that moment in Mexico really began my journey to understand and define and experiment with energy justice. That journey also made a stop in Hawaii, which is the university, which is the state that I lived in before joining the faculty at Northeastern. Again, I had a front row seat to some really fascinating stuff. I landed in Hawaii in 2014, just as the state was embarking on one of the most ambitious clean energy transitions in the country. In the summer after I arrived, the legislature passed and the governor signed into law HB 623, which was the country's first 100% renewable portfolio standard, which set the goal of meeting all of the state's energy needs through clean energy, renewable energy by 2045. And so I got to see that state go through its own growing pains around the dynamics of rooftop solar, the dynamics of community solar, which are things that Joan spoke about, as well as issues of equity. So based on my experience in Mexico, I came into Hawaii sort of raising a lot of questions about equity, raising a lot of questions about whether we would replicate inequality in our transition. And to a person, when I raised that question, you know, how are we going to bring communities into this conversation? How are we going to use the energy system as a mechanism to remediate structural inequality? I was looked at as if I had 3 or 4 heads. Most of the decision makers in Hawaii, most of the stakeholders who were engaged in policy, engaged in the debates around the energy transition, saw the energy transition as a purely technical issue. And this is what Jenny also spoke about, as well as Joan, I think, where energy is really seen as a matter of whether or not the lights turn on and not a matter of whether you're breathing in toxic fuels or fumes, or whether there is a massive energy facility in your backyard. So I went in with my work in Hawaii and really focused on domestic policy and the ways in which Hawaii's transition could be used as a mechanism for energy justice and for deeper remediation of the structural inequality in our system. Fast forward a few years, I'm now here at Northeastern. I run an organization called the Initiative for Energy Justice. I founded it with two other lawyers, Sivan Devar, Shiva Prakash. These are my thought partners and my co-conspirators, each of whom was working in a jurisdiction similar to Hawaii, Sivan in California, Shiva in New York. And these were states that were also experimenting with aggressive and ambitious climate and energy legislation, but often leaving communities behind. And more often than not, we found that the communities who were engaged in civil rights struggles, who were engaged in more traditional social justice matters, understood the intimate ways that the energy system impacted their lives, but often lacked the technical chops to engage in the policymaking debate. And on the other hand, many of the policymakers who were engaged in creating energy policy didn't understand how equity fit into what they were doing. And so we formed the initiative to really fill that gap with research and technical assistance. So I want to bring us back to today, right? I just offered a little bit of background on who I am, what I do, how I got here, why I do it. But I want to focus on this particular moment. This is an extraordinary moment. It's a moment of reckoning. We are reckoning with our systems. We are reckoning with racial injustice. We are reckoning with structural inequality across many domains in our society. And I would argue that energy is not immune from this deeper reckoning, and that we need to reckon with the ways in which our energy system is a player and an actor in the structural violence that we see in our communities. So we knew early on that COVID had some extraordinary impacts on Black and Brown communities in this country, and we're still seeing some of those impacts, right? Black and Brown communities are more likely to be infected. They're more likely to die. The New York Times put out a study in July illustrating that Black communities are 3 times as likely to be exposed, twice as likely to die. Extraordinary impacts. There was a study that was released in early on in the pandemic. It was not yet peer reviewed by the Harvard Chan School of Public Health that showed that folks who were exposed to just a small amount of air pollution had a large increase in expectancy related to deaths due to the COVID-19 disease. And so we know who those communities are, right? Who is exposed to more pollution in this society? Who's exposed to more air pollution? Black and Brown folks, right? Black and Latinx communities. This is a pattern that we see play out here in Boston. And so my research team and I have been sort of poking around, really trying to link our work to what's happening right in our backyard. We did a very rough analysis of exposure to COVID-19, and we see a very familiar pattern here on the left side of the slide. Our Black and Brown communities, Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, Revere, Chelsea. At one point, Chelsea was a city in the country with the highest COVID-19 infection rates. On the right side, you see that these same communities are environmental justice communities. And what that means is that they will face the most devastating impact of the disease, right? And this is not accidental. This is due to decisions that have been made through policy. In essence, these folks can't breathe, and they have not been able to breathe for decades. This is not an image from Boston. This is an image on the right from Port Arthur, Texas, which is a place where my father's family is from, born and raised. It is also the birthplace and the epicenter of the modern fossil fuel industry. It is a place where calls to shelter in place were common before the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is because of the toxins that pervade the air there. And these are Black and Brown bodies that are continuing to breathe this in. So we know a lot about the energy system in terms of environmental justice. Great shout out to Dr. Bullard in his amazing path-breaking work on energy or on environmental justice. But we also know that energy burden and energy insecurity are significant things that are facing our Black and brown communities here, as well as low-income communities around the country. Energy burden, it refers to the amount of your overall income that you spend on energy. For poor folks, for low to moderate income folks, obviously that amount is higher in terms of percentage of overall income. Energy insecurity is lacking reliable access to uninterrupted energy sources at an affordable price. The EIA, and I just want to thank my research team for helping pull together some of these slides. The EIA back in 2018 put out a study that showed that energy insecurity is a pervasive problem around the country. And that means, again, making difficult decisions about how you spend your household income. But it is a devastating problem for Black and brown folks. And this slide should really send a chill down the spine of folks who care about justice. 45% of Latinx folks have experienced some sort of energy insecurity. Black and African American folks experience energy insecurity at a rate of 1 to 2. And then the problem is extraordinary in Native communities as well. So again, this moment is an opportunity for us to reckon with those issues that are not new. This is a slide that comes out of the Center for Biological Diversity, which early on began to track the various moratoria on utility shutoffs that were connected to COVID. So utilities, some voluntarily, not through the industry group, and governors as well as regulators began to enact moratoria on shutting people off of their electricity during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly during the initiation of these public health emergency declarations. There were 36 states that had moratoria at the beginning. We've now seen 20 of those states have their moratoria expire. 16 remain active, 3 are expiring soon. And what does this mean? This is not just numbers. These are people, these are families, this is millions of people who are going to be impacted when their bills come due, because we know the COVID pandemic continues and the economic crisis continues. And so I would propose revolutionary power as a way to begin to reckon with these inequalities that are embedded in our energy system. I would argue that although the energy system is a root cause of much of what ails us, particularly in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, it is also a pathway to our liberation. We need to do a lot, though, in order to get to that liberation. We need to acknowledge the legacy of harm that plagues communities of color around the country. We need to demand justice on the pathway to 100% clean energy. And that means baking equity into policy at the outset. We also need to disrupt the investor-owned utility model. I haven't talked a lot about that today, but I'm happy to do so. We need to lower energy burden and reduce energy insecurity through policy, and we can do that. And then we also need to increase clean energy access in BIPOC communities. There have been a couple of recent studies that show that even when you control for home ownership, even when you control for income, meaning all things equal, Black and brown people have less access to solar than white communities. We need to question why. We need to design our policies to remediate those gaps. In short, we need to design energy policy in a way that stops killing us. And we actually, I think, have an extraordinary moment to use energy policy as a pathway, as I said, to liberation. And I've also written a book. My book is not out yet. It'll be out in January. It's Revolutionary Power. I couldn't have predicted this moment. It seems like the book is designed for today, and I hope will serve as a toolkit to policymakers and advocates who are working on these issues and fighting the good fight. So thanks, Ted, for allowing me to be a part of this great conversation.
Well, you know, this is very much a conversation of this moment. Revolutionary activities are taking place around the world. There's been a fundamental reassessment of the need for renewable energy. One of the challenges, though, which several of you raised, is one of how one goes about mobilizing underrepresented communities to raise the level of urgency around actually addressing these issues. There's been resistance, obviously, on the part of the major energy companies. How do we overcome that? And how do we actually mobilize communities to become involved in this issue, as well as the issues of policing, education, economic disparities? Maybe we could have some comments on that. And also I remind our viewers that if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box and we will get to them. Who wants to start with that? How do you actually engage the communities that are most impacted?
So I can start. I think it's always important to meet people where they are. And I think many underrepresented communities, BIPOC communities, Indigenous folk, they're living and thinking in intersectional ways, but also in intergenerational ways. And so that's why I think it's really important to focus on youth and engaging families. I know there's, for example, there are feminists working in New Orleans who don't necessarily center their analysis rhetorically around engaging women. They say engaging women in their families. And so I think that's one way to engage folks. So, parents, busy parents, like they're getting that information, at least in pre-COVID times when they're picking their kids up from school, or if you're having like cultural events, like here in Louisiana, we have second lines and things of that nature, having folk out giving that information. So curious to hear what everyone else thinks, but yeah, I would say meeting people where they are and engaging families holistically and thinking intergenerationally.
Joan?
I would also, go ahead, Joan, yeah.
Either way, I would suggest two things. And one is inclusionary planning. And we recently had a workshop focusing on Austin, Texas and Providence, Rhode Island, two cities that recently updated their climate action plans and decided that the focus was going to be on equity, producing a climate justice plan and a climate equity plan, and taking great measures to work with community members, residents of frontline communities, in establishing the goals of the climate plan. Another way of looking at that is citizen science or community science, which we had a workshop on last night. And to the extent that you engage people in understanding the science, understanding what is happening to them in terms of levels of pollution and so forth, they become much more engaged in looking at solutions. So I think participation and engagement is a big part of what needs to happen.
Shalanda?
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if we were going to go in order of presenters, but I was so excited to answer the question. I think the evidence is there. Communities are engaged. I think as Jennie's presentation illustrates, there are many folks of color, women who are doing the work. There are some structural barriers to their inclusion. And, Frances and I actually had the opportunity to attend the COP last year in Madrid, where there was a fascinating and rich conversation happening around a feminist Green New Deal, around justice. But as soon as you left those side events, you were in the mainstream conversation, which was dominated by white men. And so the conversation is happening. I think communities have an exquisite analysis of the ways that all of these pieces fit together. But I think as scholars, we owe them the work to really tie together some of the pieces. So I've been really interested in how COVID connects to Black Lives Matter, connects to energy policy, connects to climate vulnerability. This is the time. It's go time. And I love it because everything that we've been working on is now playing out right before our eyes, for better or worse. But we, I think as scholars, need to do that work. Communities already have the analysis. They just need the backup. You know, they need the ammunition to go in and say, you can no longer ignore us. You can no longer create policies that engage violence on my home and my family and my community. And here's the data to support it.
Jennie?
And I would just second that and say that there's a lot more happening than is acknowledged in kind of the mainstream media or the mainstream perceptions, and especially when you think about climate not as this separate issue, but how it is connected. Climate and energy are both connected to so many aspects of what people are struggling with and worrying about. And as Shalanda's presentation pointed out, it's so central, and yet so many people are vulnerable when it comes to both energy and climate impacts of all kinds. So I think, you know, we're at this time where we have this proposal for a Green New Deal that several of us mentioned, which is, you know, it's a framework, and it's a way to connect with jobs and economic justice and more, and that also is what people and communities need right now is big public investment, and so I think that's also the coalitions that are building to figure out how that's structured and what that actually means are really, really important right now, and there's a lot happening.
If there were to be a new administration in Washington in January, how would you prioritize what should happen first? There's been a lot of planning that's gone on. We have data on what should happen, but how do you prioritize that, particularly in this period when local revenues and some federal revenues will be smaller, and there may be less money around to spend on these kinds of activities? Who wants to start?
I mean, I guess I would just say that we're, again, I think there's a lot of preparation and work going on that has been actually building over the past 3+ years, that's been preparing for when we have an opportunity to elevate these issues. And the challenge has been is not just that we have been in a steady state for the past 3.5 years. We've actually things have gotten worse with regard to in so many ways in terms of climate and energy, with this dismantling of regulations and goals and pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, and you know, really promoting fossil fuel industry, and so I think there's we're in a place where there's a lot of potential, and I think a lot of different constituents in a collaborative way are preparing for the possibilities ahead, and others may have some more specific. I know Frances has been working on the feminist principles for the Green New Deal. This might be a great time to elevate what some of those are.
And perhaps Frances can speak to that.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of feminists here in the Gulf South, but also in the Global South and the Global North, are really thinking about elevating this conversation around care, and also understanding that some of this green infrastructure, some of these greening initiatives, these techno fixes are actually going to increase the time and resources needed to reproduce society. And so how do we share those burdens more equitably throughout society? So for example, the feminist agenda for a Green New Deal is once again thinking about scenario planning for what should we do as soon as if Trump is elected, if Biden is elected, if there's chaos, like what do we want to prioritize? And so we'll be publishing some op-eds and articles about that in the coming weeks, actually in the next 2 weeks. Also, we would say advancing an intersectional gender analysis, because we don't want any of our solutions to exacerbate inequality, also lifting up reproductive justice and rejecting those false solutions for climate change, and promoting a regenerative economy and feminist economics, because oftentimes we are locked in due to these myths of classical economics about how economies, how stimulus packages work. And as we've seen in the COVID response, rapid response, that a lot of what we thought was true was actually false. So really dealing with those myths and lifting up these narratives that confront institutional patriarchy and racism, and also lift up community-led and democratic solutions.
You know, we have some interrelated questions here that relate very specifically to what you've just said. A number of the workers in the energy industry are people of color and individuals who have been supporting their families, while the owners of utility companies have actually worked within a business model that has done very well for them, but they tend not to be the same people who might lose their jobs as we transition from where we are today to a greener economy. How does one go about changing the business model for those utility and energy companies? And what does one do to support the workers who may well lose their jobs because they're now working in a very dirty part of the energy industry? Let's start with Shalanda.
Hey, thanks, Ted, for the question, and thanks to the attendees who are engaged in the Q&A. I'd like to answer this by picking up on something that Frances said and that she referred to. So she referred to the CARES Act, which is a $2 trillion, I know we don't call it a stimulus. You know, the language around it has been a little tricky, but this is an infusion of cash into our economy. And I think we have to sort of subvert and that's radical, right? $2 trillion is radical. Let's just be clear about that. But I think when we talk about the Green New Deal, when we talk about the extraordinary investment that it will take to roll out our Green New Deal, the dollar signs associated with that become a non-starter. But I think the question that many of us have been asking is, what is the cost of inaction, right? That's tremendous. So I think we can use the CARES Act as a touchstone when we think about what it will take to do this transition and what it will take to do it in a way that is just. And so, Ted, this gets to your question around how do we deal with the workers who are going to be phased out, essentially, of their current employment when we make this broader transition. We will absolutely need a full court press on solar. We're absolutely going to need to max out energy efficiency opportunities, the things that Joan was talking about in terms of job creation, but also reducing bills. Efficiency and solar are pathways to that creation. We need to train people. We have folks like Grid Alternatives, who I like them in a lot of ways, and I have some problems with them in others. But they're engaged in that sort of job creation work. Solar United Neighbors, based in DC, is another organization that is all about rooftop, but all about kind of using rooftop installation as a mechanism for job creation. So we can't stop this transition, but we also need not balk at the price tag that is required. And I am encouraged by the people that are having the conversation with Biden's team and that are on that team, engaged in this work. I think they're ambitious. I think they care about environmental justice, and they're really working to center the folks who have been so marginalized within the system in this transition. So it's an exciting time. It's a potentially transformative time. But as you mentioned, Ted, we're going to need money flowing down to the states. And again, we cannot balk at the amount that is required. Just 10 seconds on the utility transition stuff. Stay tuned for April and May. This is when a lot of the winter moratoria are going to roll off, and we're going to have utilities pleading and begging to the regulators in their states to save them from the debt, the backlog of debt from unpaid utility bills because they have a deal. It's the regulatory compact where they get a reasonable return on investments and they have an expectation. Their shareholders have expectations regarding what they're going to get at the end of the day. I think it's going to be the wild, wild west and really interesting. And it could also be an opportunity to begin to disrupt the utility model.
May I speak to that, Ted?
Sure.
I want to agree with everyone, but Shalanda's last point about the people who are working with the Biden team on that. And I think sometimes I feel like such a pragmatist when I'm in a panel with my colleagues. And you know, the Biden plan is actually pretty good. It's 1.7 billion over 10 years. And putting a lot of control in cities and states. What it doesn't do are many of the things that the three of you have talked about in terms of other agendas and how you bring that to the forefront. And so I think, you know, Frances, when you're talking about op-eds and other ways, getting in on those committees that are already, you know, working on a transition, you know, cross our fingers that this happens. That's very important. But one of the questions raised that I think is really important has to do with the transition of people from the fossil fuel industry. And Shalanda, you're right in terms of you can't balk at the money, but one of the best plans about this is Bob Poland at UMass Amherst, the Political Economy Research Institute, where he's really worked out the numbers. And he argues it's about $12 billion over 20 years. But of that, about 600 million goes into 300 million a year for reemployment and support for displaced workers from the fossil fuel industry. And that is retraining, employment compensation insurance, and looking at pension fund programs that they don't have, as well as those community transitions. So I think particularly when you look at the huge urban-rural divide that exists in our nation, that this Green New Deal absolutely has to have sufficient investment in the transition for those workers from the fossil fuel industry.
Could folks comment on their understandings of the differences between the Biden plan and the Green New Deal? One of our viewers has said that as far as he can tell, the reason that Biden has not been critical of fracking by saying he will just end it relates to the pragmatic view that he has to win in Pennsylvania, and that the people who've been involved with fracking and all of the harm that has done in the environment in Western Pennsylvania in particular are not interested in losing their jobs at this moment. And I've seen advertising for the president that is very critical of the Biden plan because it might diminish fracking. So how do we deal with the political reality of transitioning people, and also how that is marketed as a difference between the Biden plan and the Green New Deal?
So I guess I wanted to first comment on the last question, and then I'll open it up for, I guess, my fellow panelists to comment on Biden's reticence to talk about the Green New Deal at times. I would just say that when we talk about a just transition, there's many scholars who analyze what does that really mean, how will that actually play out. But I think it's important to lift up those regions of the country where we have a large majority of these workers in oil and gas and even petrochemicals, such as the Gulf South. And so organizations such as the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, they have a Gulf South for a Green New Deal policy platform that talks about how do we transition workers in these industries in terms of building community wealth and also dealing with this legacy of weak labor laws. There's a reason that these sacrifice or extractive energy sacrifice zones, as environmental anthropologist Julie Maldonado calls it, in particular communities. And then also I would say from a feminist perspective, we have to actually once again focus on this idea of low carbon care jobs as green jobs. And then we can actually redistribute care burdens in society, and also think about, initiatives such as a reduced work week. And then once if we're redistributing care jobs throughout society, that means that some of the workers in these extractive industries would actually now be taking on jobs in education, essential workers working in service industries, hospitals, also childcare. So rethinking what we mean by green jobs, and then redistributing the burdens of caretaking labor.
Others?
Shalanda, did you want to go? Just to speak to Biden's plan versus the Green New Deal, and in some ways, I think you can say they're comparable and not that different. And I think it seems to be quite a strategic move, similar to the refusal to state that they're going to ban fracking, to not associate directly with the Green New Deal. But it's a very subtle distinction, I think. And so my own sense is that, whoever's at the top of the ticket is playing, these political calculations right now in these weeks coming up. But if we have new leadership, I think there will be, kind of a groundswell of support for a Green New Deal. And what that means, obviously, is still to be determined in terms of how broad, how big, how much is included, how much is constricted to more conventional sense of what's climate and energy versus these broader issues that Frances is raising in terms of redefining the workforce and care related jobs as part of green jobs, and expanding also to different issues related to public housing and transportation and a broader purview. But maybe Shalanda has comments on that too, perhaps.
I think everything has been said in terms of Biden and the line that he's sort of walking right now politically. But I do want to return to this idea of pragmatism, because for me, this has been something that has plagued me in my scholarship, plagued me in the actual practical work of trying to get things done. And for me, I think the moment sort of calls for something different, and this is absolutely where we're going to have a little bit of tension here, because what does pragmatism look like in the face of blackouts that happen in California because of a centralized utility and a failure to invest in microgrids and other resiliency measures? What does pragmatism look like when you're on a medical device and you don't know when your power is going to come back on, and there's a global pandemic and you're low income? To me, pragmatism is not going to be the answer. Obviously we need incrementalism in some ways, but I just see that we are in an extreme and extraordinary circumstance. When California first initiated these so-called public safety power shutoffs last fall in a very deliberate way, we had millions of people without power in the United States. And it wasn't because there was a threat. There was no fire in sight, right? This is power shutoffs on a sunny day. So I'd love to just kind of think through how we balance the need for action in the face of these extremes. And I would argue that we need extreme policy responses in light of the gross injustices that are playing out in this climate moment.
May I respond a little bit, since I raised pragmatism? When I say pragmatism, I don't mean incrementalism at all. I just mean, okay, we've got a candidate, Joe Biden. Let's hope he's elected. He has a plan on the table. what are the mechanisms we can use to make sure that the anti-racist, anti-feminist, pro-utility kind of policies can be integrated into that? What are the avenues that we have to make that change? Because it's not a big window that there's going to be. But another aspect of pragmatism for me, we've all talked about green jobs. Well, if we don't have a Green New Deal that really addresses trade and our trade policy, we're not going to have the green manufacturing jobs that we're all hoping for. And so to me, that's a very pragmatic concern, and it has to be on the table. So I have the same agenda in mind, but just slightly different strategies of how to get there.
I think that's great. And I also want to add to the list there, supply chain issues. For this transition to happen on the scale that we are all hoping it happens on, we're actually dealing with displacing a lot of our burdens, our environmental burdens, to the global south. And, the source materials that go into panels, solar panels, the source materials that are required come from kids on the African continent and salt flats in Latin America. The batteries that are going to be needed, the storage, if we're going in the direction of storage. So I think we have to grapple with all of the justice issues from inception to implementation, and then after that, because this stuff isn't going to last forever. And you better believe that they're going to go back to Black and brown communities to bury the waste that comes out of this moment. So I think this is absolutely complex. There's no black and white, and we have to be thinking about all of these issues today.
Let me ask one last question that has come in from one of our viewers, a graduate student at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. Given that much of what you've referred to is part of a feminist agenda, as much as an energy justice agenda, the questioner wants to know, how do we address these issues in a way that deals with future generations and with the engagement of generations that haven't yet come into being? How do we really place this in a future-oriented sense, in a way that really begins to talk about the kind of world that we want to have, and how, in a pragmatic way, we go about getting there?
So I will quickly address that and just say that that is why it's so important that social justice, economic justice, and racial justice are at the core of all of our climate and energy policies, so that we are able to prepare for a prosperous and equitable future for everybody. And I think all too often what's happened in the past is that our policies and the leadership in these areas hasn't been considering the social justice implications, economic justice and racial justice issues. So we've ended up with policies that have exacerbated and perpetuated inequities rather than the opposite. So we really need to flip it around and prioritize the places and the communities and the people that have been underinvested in for too long, and that will address future generations as well.
Yeah, I would just like to add that, I mean, let's be clear, like the Green New Deal is not like a magic pill, like this is long-term investment. So we're talking about planning for future generations. We're talking about our design, even our design of cities, which I think Joan mentioned, like all of that is future oriented. But I think lifting up the youth leadership, which is one of the principles of the feminist Green New Deal, is key. We wouldn't even have this robust conversation about the Green New Deal here in the United States if it wasn't for the leadership of youth, and for example, the Sunrise Movement, and indigenous youth and other youth who have been advocating at these international climate negotiations. So continuing to lift up the solutions from the left and below, I think, is really important.
And as among all of the differing viewpoints that you've encountered in discussions with community groups in particular, how do you go about reconciling those differing viewpoints, bringing a focus to them so that they can then be translated into policy at both the local level and nationally? What are the tools for bringing people together around these kinds of issues is a question that's come in from one of our viewers.
I know that there are at least 2 researchers from the Initiative for Energy Justice who are in the audience, and they can answer this, but the response is that it is slow and it takes a lot of work and relationship building and checking in, and it's one of the reasons why people don't do it, because you have to engage and, as Frances said, meet people where they are with such respect for their expertise, because there is deep expertise in communities. They have the answers. We, as policy experts and legal experts, have to do that translation work, but we have to listen. And that sometimes means hours of being in deep community and conversation with people. And, you know, if I'm honest, I'm not always the best at that, but it is something that I'm so committed to in my work.
Anyone else?
I guess I would just add, I think we've seen really great examples of, like, for example, Green New Deal town halls. Those have been going on in the Gulf South, but also around the United States. Internationally, I see climate activists and feminists engaging civil society and the public around the planning for the future and what will work for particular localities, because we know that it's not necessarily like a package of best practices, but it has to be tailored for a specific locality. And then also, I think this is where feminist methods and methodologies come in terms of thinking as a scholar and an activist. You know, we have skills in focus groups. We have skills in coalition building. We have skills in storytelling and narratives, oral histories. And so I think that a lot of these feminist economics. So a lot of these methodologies that climate activists and feminist researchers use will be really important in increasing awareness and you know, making sure that everyone is included in this vision for the future.
So are there brief closing comments that each of you might like to make, keeping in mind that this semester we focused on trying to set an agenda for 2021, whoever happens to win in 2 weeks. How would you prioritize things, and what final comments might you make? I know that's a big question, but we're going to be asked to raise these issues and to translate them into policy.
So if Joe Biden wins, we have a Green New Deal proposal that isn't perfect, but we can work to build on that. If Donald Trump wins, it's a totally different game, and the arena of action has got to be at the state and local level with trying to influence federal and you know, create these international partnerships. But it's obviously a much more gloomy scenario.
I would say similarly. I mean, similarly, and also, I think the work is always going to be at the state level. But in terms of prioritizing action, again, I know I'm sort of beating a drum here, but we're going to see folks in the spring who will have hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars of back utility bills due. We need federal relief for that and a mechanism to facilitate that financial relief. I also think, as Frances said so eloquently, we have to tell our stories in this work and elevate the lived experiences of those who are living environmental justice, climate justice, the racial inequities, and COVID impacts, right? We need to know their stories, and they have to have a voice at the policymaking table.
Yeah, I would just briefly say we need to redistribute power, literally and figuratively. Keep the eye on the ball in terms of, regardless of what happens longer term. We also need to be continuing to anchor social justice and racial justice and economic justice at every step of every scale and every level of whatever we're trying to do.
I agree completely with Jennie, and I would just add that for me, it's all about accessibility. So making sure that there's points of entry for folk from all walks of life, all levels of education, expertise to get involved in these conversations. Also creating those, I hate to use the word pipelines, but mentorship programs for folks to get more involved in these climate policy spaces so that when we look down the line in 10, 20 years, these negotiations look a lot different. These policy and decision-making spaces look a lot different. So yeah, accessibility and also mentoring the next generation.
Well, thank you all for a very enlightening and engaged conversation. It could hardly be more timely. We will have another timely conversation next week. As things now stand, there is a scheduled vote on a new Supreme Court judge that is set up for the beginning of next week. And on Wednesday, coincidentally, we'll be discussing the Supreme Court and where it's been and directions that it might begin to take in our pre-election conversation. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. I want to thank our panelists in particular for a very, I think, unique and enlightened conversation. And I look forward to being with folks again next week and the week after for our post-election wrap up as well. Take care and have a good evening.